Good morning. Today is Wednesday, and it is July 31, 2019. Welcome to the regular meeting of the Lane County Board of Commissioners, continued from yesterday. We have 4 items on our agenda today. First is our work session on the birth center. The second is the Good Neighbor Authority opportunities. We'll have an executive session dealing with real property matters. And then the all-encompassing other business, which I don't know if we'll have any other business, but so the main 3 are our work session on Peace Health, closure of Peace Health Birth Center. And I'd like to invite the people involved with the birth center item up to the table. And we had kind of set this up as a 15-minute presentation followed by 45 minutes of discussion. And so I think we could probably go 10 for the department and 10 for the advocates for the birth center, and then maybe 40 minutes for the Board of Commissioners. So I'll turn it over to Ms. Gaffney for 10 minutes. Welcome.
Good morning, Chair Sorensen and Commissioners. And before I start, I'm going to let our other guests at the table introduce themselves as well.
Hi, my name is Jenny Noyce. I'm on the executive board of the Lane County Friends of the Birth Center.
I'm Iris Bixler. I work in health policy here in the area.
Right, so my goal this morning is just to tee up our discussion a little bit, and it may not take a full 10 minutes. I definitely want to leave the bulk of the time for discussion amongst the board. By way of reminder, the board has asked that we schedule a joint meeting and invite the Friends of the Birth Center, Peace Health, and the state of Oregon to participate in a joint meeting. We issued those invitations. Peace Health and the state are choosing not to be here today, so we're going to go ahead with the conversation. I did attach in your written materials a flyer or a letter that Peace Health sent to be included, so that's there. And again, the purpose of the meeting today was to really talk about a couple issues initially. So one of those was most clearly the closure by Peace Health of the freestanding birth center that they own and operate. And that is scheduled to close at the end of August. And I haven't heard any changes since we submitted the written materials about that. So I think that still is the plan moving forward. I also want to clarify, I know in some of the reports in the media and other conversations, there have been questions raised and concerns about impacts that closure might have on the prenatal services that are offered through the community health center at our Charlton clinic. And I know when we submitted the written materials that there was still a few unknowns about that, and I did want to clarify today that Peace Health has assured us they are not changing their contract to provide midwives to us to operate the birth center, so I don't anticipate any changes in the prenatal clinic that the county operates at the community health center. So I wanted to be able to put that to rest so we really could focus today the discussions around the freestanding birth center that Peace Health has operated. And again, you asked for an opportunity to talk about the impacts in the community. I do want to point out in the packet, well, I guess before we talk about the packet, there were a couple questions that were raised in agenda setting and also by the board when you made this assignment to us. So I wanted to clarify some of that too, and really acknowledge assistance from Jeff Kincaid in county administration, who has helped with some of the research to get answers to those questions. There are currently 15 freestanding birth centers in Oregon. All of them are operated by the private sector, most of those by LLCs, and we have a list of those at some point if you're curious about what those are. We've been asked about what the response has been from other counties where birth centers have closed, and so we did ask Jeff to take a look at what he could find out in terms of answers to that question. He said he looked at about 12 closures that have happened nationally and was not able to find any particular action taken by counties in response. He did note that recently the birth center that's located in Deschutes County was closed by St. Charles Hospital, and that the city expressed opposition to that, but there wasn't anything in the record in terms of county action related to that. And finally, we were asked about the potential role for the county in terms of mitigating impacts to Peace Health's decision. And I think for that piece, I would point back to some of the material that's in the packet for you, and I'm happy to talk more about our concerns as a department in terms of asking us to expand our scope to include obstetrics and labor and delivery. That would be very clearly different than the scope we have right now at the community health centers, and would be worth a significant conversation if the board wants to pursue that. A couple areas of concern for us as we think about that. Strategically, you've charged the department and our CHC with looking at that niche around expanding access to primary care and behavioral health. And so in terms of your priorities in the strategic plan, that's been your direction to us. So we've looked at a number of strategies, most recently, as you know, looking at opening a new clinic in Cottage Grove. So our focus has been around primary care and access to the large numbers of vulnerable people who are uninsured or underinsured in the community. So strategically, I would say that's much more our niche, and in terms of the staff expertise that we have, that's would more clearly define our role in the community right now. So I would express some concerns around both complexity of what this new book of business would look like, and risk mitigation, and of course some of the financial risks that Peace Health has expressed would probably be true for us as well. And then finally, just in closure, I would talk about opportunity costs, and I know this is in the written materials as well, and we've had a number of discussions that always, if we choose to do one thing, then looking at what is it that we won't do in order to make space for that. Finally, before I turn it over, I just want to tell you, I know we've had an opportunity to hear a lot from the community about what a precious resource this has been, and I want to acknowledge that too. Each of you have talked about your experiences and your birth stories. I will say I'm a huge supporter. My son was delivered at the birth center 24 years ago, so I value the service in the community absolutely, and my concerns about our capacity to provide that service are not at all related to whether or not it's an important service in the community. It absolutely is. So on that note, I'm going to turn it over to the Friends of the Birth Center, and then I'm happy to answer any questions that the board might have moving forward.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Jenny Noyce. I'm an executive board member of Lane County Friends of the Birth Center. Friends of the Birth Center is a volunteer-led organization that works to ensure that midwifery birth center services are available in Lane County. Volunteers initially mobilized in 2008 to ensure that the original birth center, which has been in operation since the 1970s, would have a new home. As a result of its efforts and partnerships with other advocates, the current birth center was built in 2009 from community donations by those who recognize the value of the birth center to our community. The Friends of the Birth Center now acts as a consumer advisory board for the Nurse Midwifery Birth Center, whose accreditation requires a consumer voice. We appreciate your invitation to participate in this work session, and we're gratified that the Board of Commissioners and the Department of Health and Human Services take seriously the negative consequences that will result from the closure of the birth center in absence of a plan to prevent gaps in coverage. Our organization seeks to ensure that families in Lane County have access to integrated birth center care, which is proven to contribute to best outcomes for women and babies. We look forward to working together going forward. I'd like to briefly describe my own experience as a birth center parent in order to demonstrate both what is unique about birth center care and what will be lost if our community loses its birth center. When my partner and I moved to Eugene 10 years ago so that I could attend graduate school at the University of Oregon, I learned from other graduate students about the Nurse Midwifery Birth Center. I began seeing the midwives for my yearly well woman visits and for birth control. Years later, when I became pregnant for the first time, I was counseled through a miscarriage by a midwife whom I had come to know over time and who would later attend both of my daughter's births. In 2012, as we prepared for my first daughter's birth, we attended birthing classes at the birth center and forged relationships with our peers that supported us throughout the early years of parenting and which continue into the present. I received all of my prenatal care at the birth center and gave birth to both of my daughters there as my partner and I had hoped. When our babies were newborns, I took them to the baby clinic where they could be weighed, have their hearing tested, and where I could visit with nurses and certified lactation consultants about questions and ongoing concerns. My first daughter and I encountered a breastfeeding crisis early on. At baby clinic, a lactation expert was able to intervene and support me in persevering. I feel sure that had we not had this kind of expert help, we would not have continued breastfeeding. I continue to visit the birth center yearly for my well woman visits. I have always been grateful that my family was able to choose a midwifery practice to care for and support us through the many travails of pregnancy and parenting. By supporting the birth center, Lane County has long been at the vanguard of supporting women's birth choice and evidence-based practices for low-risk birth. I share all of this in order to illustrate the wide variety of services that an accredited freestanding birth center can provide. Every one of these categories of care, gynecological, preventive, mental health, prenatal, postnatal, lactation, is provided by expert professional providers in a single location that is familiar to clients. And all these forms of care have been proven to contribute to best outcomes for mothers and babies. People who are supported in the ways I was supported and who are known by their providers and who know to whom to direct their questions are more mentally and physically healthy. The distinct model of care that midwives provide contributes to lower C-section rates, lower rates of low birth weight in infants, and increased success in breastfeeding. These are all concrete ways that a birth center contributes to the health and well-being of our community's tiniest citizens and the parents who birth and nurture them. Currently, the birth center's midwives and staff perform this form of integrated care at the birth center, at Riverbend Hospital, and at the Community Health Center's prenatal clinic. Women and families from all demographics in Lane County, including those who give birth in the hospital, have access to this high-touch, low-intervention model of care. Birth center care is equitable care, and Lane County Friends of the Birth Center believe strongly that women of all ages and backgrounds, with all variety of medical histories, and with all manner of beliefs about birth, are supported and empowered within a birth center model of care. We have several specific concerns about how the birth center's closure will negatively affect our community. Peace Health's decision to close the birth center, announced in May with complete cessation of services as of August 30th, will result in gaps in care. Peace Health has reneged on its responsibility to patients by neglecting to ensure that they will have access to fully integrated midwifery care, or even making it possible for currently pregnant mothers to deliver with the care provider of their choice. Peace Health is opting to close a thriving community health practice in order to partner more closely with a private for-profit OBGYN practice. The transitional services that Peace Health has announced are a step in the right direction. More midwives in more places is a net positive for our community. But as of now, only one full-time midwife has been hired there, and newer midwives may not be permitted to attend births on their own. There's a period of proctoring at the beginning of a midwife's career in Oregon. A fully functional integrated practice of the kind I have described takes more than 2 months to get running. Until this happens, women will receive a fragmented form of care from any number of separate providers. Not all women who choose to give birth with a midwife will be able to do so, and there will be no out-of-hospital birth option. Peace Health, in making this abrupt and callous decision, makes it impossible for women to choose how and with whom they want to give birth, and introduces a host of complicated considerations into a system that has historically guaranteed continuity of care. We hope that the Board of Commissioners and the county agrees with Friends of the Birth Center that one healthcare provider should not be permitted to decide the manner in which Lane County women should give birth. Without the birth center and without the birth center model of care in place at the community health center, mothers will be referred out to private providers. Many of these providers place caps on the number of clients they will accept who are insured by OHP and Medicaid. We fear a shortage of caregivers for these women, many of whom are at risk of the outcomes that midwifery care succeeds in preventing. In many instances, while clients are waiting for their OHP or Medicaid to be approved, they must pay up front for initial services, which is a barrier to their receiving vital prenatal care. Many private providers also establish expectations of patients that can be difficult to meet for women who face language barriers, childcare and transportation challenges, or financial hardship. The birth center places no such barriers before those who initiate care through the midwives. We know that as of August 30th, women who receive prenatal care at Riverbend will be doing so from physicians and midwives employed by a private practice with whom Peace Health contracts. As I've tried to make clear, we believe that the time is fast approaching when these gaps in care will have real consequences for women and babies in Lane County. We share this concern with a variety of community partners, including a group of 28 community physicians and healthcare providers. Their intimate knowledge of the way that birth center care supports families leads them to support the fully integrated and evidence-based model of care practiced at the birth center. We also have the support of the Democratic Party of Lane County, Eugene City Councilor Emily Semple, State Representative Marty Wilde, Congressman Peter DeFazio, the American Association of Birth Centers, the American College of Nurse Midwifery Oregon, and Centro Latino Americano. The issue is being closely followed by Senator Merkley's office as well. The people of Lane County, furthermore, believe that our community deserves a birth center. When the existing birth center was built, the bulk of the funds for construction came from community donors who sought to help establish a birth center for future generations. 65 of these donors are asking that Peace Health return their money in light of its abandonment of that promise. And over 10,000 people in Lane County have signed a petition to insist upon the maintenance of birth center care in our community. We hope to honor the wishes of our community leaders and citizens by working to solve this problem. We aim to work alongside the Board of Commissioners and Health and Human Services to discover community partnerships, leverage helpful entities and organizations, and come up with new ideas that will result in continued access to birth center care in Lane County. Thank you.
Okay. Would you like to make some comments?
Sure. Just to introduce myself briefly, I work in health policy and health equity, specifically as it relates to traditional health workers, which include community health workers, peers, and doulas. As a doula for 23 years, I co-founded a nonprofit in 2004 called Doulas Supporting Teens that served pregnant and parenting teens here in Lane County for about 10 years. Additionally, I'm on the Oregon Health Authority's Traditional Health Worker Commission. I'm on Trillium's Clinical Advisory Panel. I'm a consultant for a new Traditional Health Worker Hub, and I chair the Lane Equity Coalition, which is part of the Community Health Improvement Plan. I hope that my experience and specifically around birth and health equity is a resource to you, and I'm here for you around that. I just want to encourage you to think about the birth center and its closure as it relates to racial equity, around healthcare access, around providers who are trauma-informed, around early learning alliance priorities around stable and attached families, about CCO's triple aim of lower cost and better care, and about public health and prevention. So again, I'm here for you as a resource to support the birth center, and I'm happy to answer any questions you have as it relates to any knowledge that I own.
Okay, well, thank you. Now, we set this up as a discussion, so I'll call on the commissioners if they have any questions, comments at this point. Okay.
I'll start.
Okay, you have a question. Very good.
I'll get this conversation started. I have a question on the actual facility building itself. Since this is closing at that location, what is happening with that building? What about the concept of simply taking over the building and keeping it running? Is that a possibility? Karen, you may have some thoughts about that. My understanding is it's owned by the hospital. And it's unfortunate, during this process, I hear that there were $750,000 in donations that came in for this. That's a lot of money from our community. And it sounds like there was no caveat in the deed that said, this funding is for this building, so this building stays in perpetuity for certain purposes. I don't know if any of that came up at the time, but it does prompt the question for me, can another entity take it over, if that's even allowed?
I can speak briefly to that. There is a group of midwives and nurses who are exploring the idea of what it would mean to have a freestanding, nonprofit accredited birth center, and that group has put the request to Peace Health if they could lease the building. They're waiting to hear back from Peace Health, their response to that question.
Yeah, Commissioner Buck and Chair Sorensen, I don't have any additional information on that. Certainly, as I said, the other 14 birth centers that exist in Oregon, most of those are run by LLCs, which sounds like the structure that this group might take if they were to operate a birth center.
My understanding is that the county, if it felt it was in the public interest and if it had the money, could use its eminent domain power to acquire the building. But that is premised upon, number one, us having the money, which I don't believe we have in our current budget, and number two, a willingness of the Board of Commissioners to acquire the property. And those are two big ifs.
Thank you, Commissioner Sorensen. And I have just a couple of questions, a couple of comments. First, I'd like to thank Commissioner Burney, who I took the note here that you were the one that called for this listening session at our board meeting 2 weeks ago, and thank you for doing that, because it really did help us to gather folks together. I wish we had broader participation, but we don't. This is what we have, and it's an opportunity for us to hear. And what I'm hoping to do, accomplish by this meeting, is determine a list of things that we as a county can actually effectively do to help retain midwife services in the county. Now, that's a pretty broad statement. I didn't say to keep the building open. I didn't say to acquire the building. Those certainly are a part of the list that I'd hope we could generate. But to begin to look at it realistically as to what we as a Board of Commissioners can do. Commissioner Sorensen's mentioning eminent domain. That's a pretty strong response, and that would take a great deal of effort and planning. So my questions are, the people who are here, can you help us to give a list of things that we can accomplish? Now, we can give you moral support. We've already done that. We've already provided testimony regarding our experiences with birth centers, and we all have positive experiences with birth centers. But that's just moral support. What can we actually do? And I have a sidelong glance at Mr. Moker. I see he's taking notes and listening to this conversation, because at the end of this day, it doesn't do us any good to try to do things that it's really quite impossible for us to do. We aren't a hospital. We do have 6 health centers. We do provide services, but we don't have capacity to provide a broader band of services. And as Ms. Gaffney has stated, our main focus is on primary care and increasing access for vulnerable people throughout the county who otherwise would not have access to primary care. That is our main mission, and that's really where our focus is. Now, inside of that mission, how can we be an effective partner and a powerful partner, and one that can help leverage, for instance, the group of midwives that you mentioned, Jenny. And your last, I wrote Moyer?
Noyce,
Noyce.
N-O-Y-C-E, yeah.
Oh, I see. I have your page open. But you mentioned a group of midwives who were trying to be in contact with Peace Health. I'll stress trying to be in contact with Peace Health to see what can be done to retain or to gain some form of control of the building itself. I'd like to hear more about that. What is it going to take for that to happen? In fact, as I heard from the banks of testimony, all good testimony that we've heard so far, a lot of it revolved around how can the people, the friends of the birth center, I'll use you as as kind of the governing group, how can you gain control of that center in order to make sure that the bottom line is that that women and families have a choice that does not include the stark environments that often surround a hospital birth. So that's my hope and my anticipation is that by the end of this, we've given it 1 hour. I think we'll go over, but that we'll come up with a list of things that we can actually realistically do as a Board of Commissioners and as a county to help in the efforts to keep midwifery available easily as a direct, easy option for giving birth in the community. And I wrote down a quote: "Women giving birth are not sick and don't need to be patients in a hospital." That kind of says it all. To be in a hospital, you enter an environment that really is not necessarily conducive to a warm, caring, gentle birth for a child. I've experienced hospital, I've experienced birth center, and there is a stark difference. So, Mr. Chair, thank you for allowing me that time, and once again, hearing more as to what we can realistically, as a county, do. Thank you.
Okay, Commissioner Burney?
First off, Iris,
Commissioner Burney.
given your background and all of the experiences and expertise you bring to the table, the fact that you're a generation younger than me is a very sobering thing indeed.
You're a good person to look up to for where to go from here. So thank you for your leadership.
You're very kind. Thank you. My understanding is that initially when this subject was brought to the Board of Commissioners, correct me if I'm wrong, but the intent was for us to support this kind of a focus and a work session and a hearing and an attempt to bring, and we did attempt to bring the disparate parties together, knowing that this was not our decision, nor was it in the realm of services that our people tell us we provide, while we're providing 5, maybe 6 in the future federally qualified health centers and a variety of developmentally disabled services. I mean, just the need exceeds supply, I think, generally in a host of areas. And this, so given that, and given the fact that through previous conversation, I would guess a majority, if not all of us, have some experience or at least a personal support of birth center services for those that opt for them in our community. But then, and having said that, though, then I have to agree with Commissioner Farr. In business, you want as many clients and as much opportunity to serve needs as possible. Here, we're restricted by the budgets that we have. So my request to you is to specifically, is to specifically identify what you think either the Board of Commissioners could do, how we actually could support this extended need in the community if we are not going to be the ones providing the dollars or the services or the facility. Because at this point in time, I think there's a general feeling and desire to help. It sounds like the transition that Peace Health is offering, which is their decision, not ours, is in your opinion inadequate, that there may be some gaps with that transition of services. And it sounds like there may be other opportunities for us to be leverage points for you, understanding that this is not a decision that was ours or something that I think we're going to be able to fill a gap on. I don't know, but I don't believe that. So I thank you. I'm with you, but I also have to deal with pragmatic realities.
Thank you. This is I know, a very emotional subject for a lot of people, and I really appreciate the service the midwifery birth center has provided over time. But, you know, like I've mentioned earlier, this is really not under the jurisdiction of Lane County, and I think our staff has explained the difficulties of us taking over a practice like this, and it being outside of our normal practice, and we understand the difficulty in transitions. You know, we've opened several clinics and had the transitioning and opening those clinic difficulties. In fact, we're having to, you know, we repurposed the first floor of our Charlton building to be our methadone clinic and realized it really isn't adequate, and now we're looking at moving that methadone clinic. So we understand not always is it easy in setting up services, getting them in the right place, and getting them smooth. So I understand there's concerns about the transition and all that, but I do, you know, we do have information from Peace Health, and Jenny, you even mentioned that currently there's 3 locations midwifery is provided, which is, you know, between our community health centers, at the hospital, and the birth center. So we're losing one of those 3 locations. But according to information provided by Peace Health, only 3% of births, occur at the current center. So 97% of births are actually happening outside of the birth center in the hospital. They're committed to providing that midwifery low intervention birth service at the hospital, and it says they're committed also to doing that in setting up a more home-like environment, not a hospital environment. One of the questions I have, and you know, I have a friend that has 2 toddlers, and I was asking him about it, and they chose not to use the birth center. And one of their concerns was, should there be a complication travel time, you know, and with babies and complications, seconds and minutes can mean brain damage and all that stuff. What is the transport time between the birth center and the hospital versus between the in-hospital birthing area and their neonatal intensive care unit and some of those things that would be there, you know, operating rooms, et cetera. You know, can somebody give me a little bit of a, you know, what is that time difference? You know, if a woman has a complication, you know, during, you know, even though she was identified as low risk, you know, which is all the birth centers really allowed to handle is low risk pregnancies, but somehow or another, you know, develops, you know, a complication, something happens during the birth, and there's either a need for an emergency C-section or there's a need to get the baby into intensive care immediately. What's that time? Because you guys aren't that far from the hospital, but.
Right. I mean, clearly, there are other experts who could answer this more specifically, i.e., you know, people from Peace Health, or if there was a midwife expert on the panel with us, which may be something we could try to make happen in the future. What I do know is that most transfers that happen to the hospital happen before a baby is born. In other words, often women who are, when it becomes clear that the woman is unable to give birth at the birth center, she will then be transferred to the hospital. And so that often, you know, presents as a non-emergent situation. The hospital, Riverbend, is so close to the birth center. That's one of the beautiful aspects of the Peace Health Birth Center being located where it is, that it is a home environment. It's a true freestanding birth center practice, and yet it's like a stone's throw from Riverbend. So I can't speak to the number of minutes that it takes to get into the hospital and be treated there, but I do know that that's one of the really incredible assets of having that birth center there, and that's why it was set up in precisely the way it is, because it is so immediately accessible to the hospital in the event that an emergent situation does arise. I don't know if anyone else would want to add anything to that. Okay.
Yeah, I just, you know, support the idea of having the low intervention birth available, but I do understand that, as we look at healthcare provision and the limited resources around it and all the difficulties in trying to provide healthcare in this nation, that sometimes difficult decisions are made for business reasons, because you just have to do that. And it sounds like, there may have been some transitional issues here, but it sounds like from what we have in black and white from Peace Health, which, they put in writing, their commitments to continue midwifery and low intervention births there at the hospital. I hope we can get past the transition ultimately and have that work out. Now, as far as the donors go for the building, and it was for a specific building, that also is kind of outside of our purview. That's really the purview of the courts and civil action. If they made donations with the specific commitment from who they were donating to and felt like that contract's been breached, that's why we have a court system in the United States, is to enforce contracts. This board can't enforce contracts that way. So that's another place where, as I've spoken to you before, that we're not the regulatory agency over hospital and medical facility locations. It's really OHA. Also, when it comes to those contracts and those donations, that's really the civil courts that handle that. So, but if there is anything we can do in maybe making sure our contract with Peace Health is upheld at our clinics and making sure those, all the various aspects of midwifery care are still here and available to the folks that are on OHA through our clinics, that's important. And we have a commitment, at least right now, from them to continue that contract. So there'll at least be 2 places instead of 3 where folks can get midwifery services and hopefully continue everything from the well woman care all the way through lactation services and postnatal services. So, I hope that this will transition and ultimately, won't seem like such a large thing, and I'm also hopeful maybe Peace Health can think about their transition a little better, maybe extend some timelines or whatever. I'm encouraging them to do what they can to make that transition a little smoother. I know as the county as a health provider has had our own difficulties in clinic startups and everything. So I get it that the transitions are bumpy. So we'll see what we can do to help.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to quickly mention that while it's true that in those remaining locations, midwifery services will be offered, so we assume that involves a lot of the other services I mentioned outside of the actual birth itself. The fact remains that there will be no out-of-hospital birth option for people in Lane County when the birth center closes beyond home-based midwives. And we know that the costs associated with a low-risk birth center birth are much lower than those associated with an in-hospital birth that requires a hospital stay, that might require, many more medical costs. So I would just point out that even though many of these services might remain in some form or another, and I would argue that they're going to be in a more fragmented form, nevertheless, the out-of-hospital birth option will go away when the birth center closes.
And additionally, if I may, that also affects unhoused women. So those who don't have the choice to birth at home, who want an out-of-hospital birth, don't have a place to go if they are unhoused.
Thank you. I'll just make a few comments. First of all, I'd like to thank Ms. Noyce and the advocates for the birth center for using strong language to condemn what Peace Health has done. Your language like they reneged, they had an abrupt and callous closure. They apparently acquired $750,000 of donations from the community for the birth center and then closed the birth center without consulting the advocacy group. So thank you for your direct comments about what the situation is. Of course, then they've refused to participate in our discussion of what are we going to do as a community now that they have announced the closure. To me, this issue does present an opportunity for the board to either say that we're done with this issue, it's a matter of private concern, county doesn't have much money, can't do much, so therefore, in 18 minutes, the board's work on this issue is done. Thank you for the information. Sorry about the closure. We feel your pain, but we can't do anything. Or we can take another path, and that is a path of more responsiveness to the legitimate concerns that have been raised here. And I favor doing more rather than dropping this at the end of this work session. I would like to know a little bit about the opportunity that Lane County has to have a county hospital. A county hospital status is something other Oregon counties have embarked upon to deal with the vagaries of what a private sector hospital can do to a community. And so that authority is there in Oregon law to form a county hospital. And I believe it's a related topic, but and that is to sponsor a county hospital district, which is separate from a county hospital. As I understand it, there are both types of districts, a county hospital as well as a hospital district in Oregon. Another thing is, and maybe you know this, but were there any public entities that contributed to the birth center? In other words, public entities meaning the county or cities or other public entities using public funds to say, yeah, we think having a birth center in Lane County is a great idea. We'd like to contribute to that, because I think that it's one thing for an individual donor who maybe sent in $25 for a birth center and said, I think it's a good idea to have a birth center. It's one thing for that to occur. It's another thing for larger entities such as counties or cities or other public entities that contributed either in-kind contributions or money, and that would be useful in terms of, well, did they get their money back? Can they get their money back? What is our role in assisting in that process? Maybe even the county itself gave money. I don't know. I'm just asking that question. And then last but not least, what is an affirmative answer to the question, what can we do, so that we're not just arguing about the past, about whether they did or did not renege, they were or were not callous, they were or were not abrupt in this decision, as the advocates have said, but rather what are we going to do so that this vital service in some form is protected and encouraged in our community. And because we have our next meeting coming up in less than 15 minutes, I just want to get out the idea that in my view, we are just beginning to ask these questions. We need a lot more work done on this, and in my view, to answer some of these questions, particularly how are we as a community going to move forward so that it's just not, well, they closed it. Thanks for your 1-hour work session. It's all up to them. It has nothing to do with the public interest, public concern, saving money, enhancing children's lives, enhancing families' lives, being a model of how this type of the birth process should be handled. And so I would welcome any of your comments on what we could do in our next round. What else would we be doing if we came here again in a month or two? What would we be doing? Because I would love to be a part of the solution rather than simply wringing our hands and saying, well, I guess somebody up in Seattle made a decision that we don't like. So if you have any response to that, what can we do or what could we do next? I would love to hear that, because I think the board is legitimately concerned about what can we do? If we don't have money to acquire a birth center, what can we do? And I think that's a legitimate question.
Okay. One idea or one sort of way of thinking about this, I think, has to do with our elected officials being in conversation with health providers about billing. The reason that I say this is because birth center births are not reimbursed fully by Medicaid. In other words, they don't, Medicaid doesn't cover the cost of a birth center birth. And I have in front of me, and I can give to you some information about House Bill 2845 that was put up in the last session that requires or asks that Medicaid be, that they reimburse for birth center births based on actual costs. This is important because if there were to be a nonprofit birth center or some other entity that was facilitating birth center births, it would be a more sort of equitable and financially sustainable process. An important point that I would like to make is that I think that whatever birth center emerges in the future, which is what we're working toward and what I'm confident will happen, it will probably look somewhat different from the birth center in the past because there were a lot of rather restrictive policies put in place during its time as an entity under Peace Health. So there were restrictions on how many weeks into a pregnancy a woman would be allowed to give birth at the birth center versus at the hospital, and other policies that, if those policies weren't in place, there would, for one thing, be higher numbers of women giving birth at the birth center, and therefore higher rates of reimbursement by insurance. So I think that in the future, if we were to continue to work on this topic, it would be useful to have Trillium, Pacific Source, other entities who can respond to questions about how these birth center births are being reimbursed by insurance.
And if I may add to that, I recently was in touch with Amanda Cobb, the executive director of Trillium. She is in the process of talking to Dr. Weiss about whether Trillium is able to come to the table and discuss a contract for the birth center in a way that we would allow for more sustainability. So that was a hopeful thing for me, that Trillium is willing to come to the table, or potentially willing to come to the table to talk about a contracted rate that would actually be a sustainable reimbursement rate.
Hey, Commissioner Buck and then Commissioner Burney.
So it now sounds like maybe there's two options, because what we're facing right now is an immediate closure. And how can we bridge a gap between an immediate closure and possibly some longer, more sustainable ways in which to keep the birth center open? And there's this potential nonprofit who has come into play that is interested in leasing the building and perhaps taking it over and continuing that on. Am I correct? How can we as a board support them? And then perhaps this Trillium intervention may be another more immediate solution. And how can we perhaps help in that regard as well? Because what I've been hearing from the public is there are women in the middle of their birth cycle that are now not going to have the services that they've had up to the point that they're at now. And in transitioning to either a healthcare provider or going straight to the hospital, their expenses are exploding. And then they pull back on health services during their pregnancy, which is the exact opposite of what we really want to see happen. So in the immediate future, my question is, how can we help support maybe those two options to bridge the immediate gap as we explore longer-term birth center viability?
Chair Sorensen, Commissioner Buck, I'm not sure if this is exactly responsive to this second piece, but I do want to clarify in terms of our prenatal services that we offer to women. So again, this is different than where do they ultimately get to deliver their baby or not. Those prenatal services that we offer to women through our clinics are absolutely continuing to move forward in support of women through their pregnancy. I think the issue is that they have fewer choices about where they will deliver when that time comes. So I don't know if that's helpful or not.
No, that's helpful. I have heard from women that are self-employed, so they don't necessarily have the same kind of health coverage, and this was a more affordable route in which to have a birth and still be able to handle their business. And so there are, gaps of folks in which a traditional method just isn't financially viable. And that's separate from the issue of the kind of more holistic services in general that the birth center provides. But we're missing folks along the way without some kind of additional birth center option. And my hope is that we as a board in some way can help support these two ideas, or maybe there's another idea that's coming into play, and lend the support we need, or, help tell us what we can do, because this discussion could take a while. And in the immediate future, these women won't have the same services available.
Okay, I have Commissioner Burney and Commissioner Farr in the queue, and we are going to start our 10 o'clock time certain pretty soon.
Pretty soon. First, I think this is very healthy. I think the discussion, especially Commissioner Bozovich said sometimes private businesses make decisions that relate to healthcare that aren't necessarily in the interest of some of the people that need healthcare, but I think that's sort of why there's a national discussion going on right now about perhaps approaching this differently. Meanwhile, back at the farm, I think that what you heard the same message from virtually every commissioner. What do? It may have had a little more emotional resonance for some than others in their delivery of it, but that's the message, right? What can we do? What can we do to help? It also sounds, I think this is healthy in that this is not necessarily going to be a direct line item of a budget that we've already approved or have to modify, but this is a community discussion that you have brought to the Board of Commissioners. And you're not just honoring the will of elected officials, you're generating the will of elected officials. I mean, let's be real. So and it sounds like you have other options you're thinking through. So I would encourage you, we have tried to bring all parties to the table. We were unsuccessful. We brought some parties. We were able to convene some. You know very well there are other tactics one can employ to try and bring all parties to the table, and my guess is you're engaged in those as well. So I'm not going to ask you the direct question for a direct answer right this moment, but I think you have the basis to think through the leverage points this Board of Commissioners can contribute to the discussion moving forward. And finally, I would like to commend Commissioner Bozovich, who has a better handle on the prenatal and postnatal services that mothers and their families need than the other four of us that have had children and grandchildren. My compliments, as usual, to my fellow commissioner. But I hope that's clear in terms of moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I will be brief. When I spoke last, I talked about can we generate a list of things that we can pragmatically, realistically do. I've generated a short list, which I'll recite based upon the conversation. And we have two issues. One is a longer-term issue and sustainability. The second is we do have some women who are in process of pregnancy that we need to bring to fruition, as Commissioner Buck just bring to the birth of their children safely and as they would wish to have that birth given. So the list that I have is, you'd mentioned House Bill 2845, which died last time. Well, for the longer term, we need to reinvigorate 2845, which will help with another point that I have, which is Medicaid doesn't cover the cost of midwifery, of health center births. So that's longer term. Short session, probably not. Long session is when we would look at that. Trillium and and Pacific Source, that we can help to lobby them to bring their resources to bear on existing pregnancies and the future of midwifery. The third is the continuation of the existing facility, and this is a big one, is that we have a facility that's currently operating. What can we do? How can we leverage nonstop services being provided there? And one of those may be through the group of midwives who are trying to negotiate with Peace Health in order to keep the services operating at that facility separate from Peace Health's control. And then the last one that I wrote down is the support of other alternatives for the immediate, for our immediate needs. One is, is there anything, Ms. Gaffney, and I'm not asking for an answer right now, that we can do to make our services more robust inside of the facilities and means that we have currently?
Chair Sorensen and Commissioner Farr, I know you aren't asking for an immediate answer. I would say that we continue to provide the full range of prenatal services. So I don't know that there are any other services short of delivering babies that we would be talking about in
And my question would be a twofold on that one. One is, can we serve more people than we're currently serving? Do we have capacity there?
And Commissioner Farr, we do. Our numbers actually have declined over time. So we can serve more people and provide prenatal services. And I would absolutely say that access to prenatal services is an important public health issue, and we continue to track on that. And I do see that as in a separate category from the question of where are the babies delivered. But that prenatal services, absolutely, we will continue to provide those.
And thank you for that, Ms. Gaffney. And I understand the constraints that we have, both budgetarily, space-wise, and professional caregivers-wise. But the conversation for the future is, can we as a county operate more directly? And Commissioner Sorensen's talking about other counties that do have county hospitals. Tillamook County, for instance, has a county hospital. And then the other, regarding other alternatives, our third child was a home birth, which attended by an MD, not by a midwife, but our home birth's a viable option for some of the folks who are in process. So those are just open questions, but that's a list of things, Mr. Mokrajski, that I generated. I'll pass it along to you just to give us ideas as to how we can help people who are currently pregnant and people who are in the near future want to retain the options that we currently or in the past have had. Well, thanks very much. This has been a good conversation, and if we have a further conversation, the 8th thing on my list was engage all parties in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. You know, I do come from a family that's a medical family. My grandfather was an immunologist with NIH, was actually there at the formation of NIH. My mom's got a doctorate in pharmacology, or had, I should say. She's passed. And my stepdad was a psychiatrist with an MD, and my sister's a psychiatrist with an MD. So sometimes I know things by absorption. But doing so, I also know that in the medical profession, that they don't like to give patients false hope. And I don't want to give the supporters of the birth center false hope. We do not own the building. So we're not going to change a decision of a closure on September 1 because we can't just grab the building and reopen it. We do not have an OB on staff that can supervise a midwife giving birth because state law requires that midwives operate under the supervision of an OB. Unless, I see somebody shaking their head back there, but I believe that there is, you know, we don't have that ability. We have to contract with, that's why our midwifery services are contracted out. So our ability to do something transitional I think, is giving false hope to say that somehow or another the county is going to step in and we're going to somehow or another keep it open for a while till we can find a permanent solution. I just don't want to give that false hope. Short of trying to go through some kind of eminent domain, which takes years, we're not going to own that building. Short of the time it takes to hire a doctor, which we have an extreme difficulty in hiring doctors anyway. It takes, a lot of recruitment to get them in the door to supervise that kind of practice. It's just not going to happen by September 1st. So I don't want to give that false hope. But, what we can do to improve our services, to maybe have the conversations with Peace Health about a longer transition, a better transition, I'm very supportive of those efforts. But I just don't want to make it sound like there's some way we're going to magically become the birth center. So I just want to make sure that's clear. And just a side comment, Medicaid also doesn't reimburse the full cost of an ambulance transport and multiple other medical procedures. It's one of the reasons why those of us with insurance get billed over $2,000 for an ambulance transport, is because they're trying to make up the cost of the $800 reimbursement from Medicaid for all those transports. So, it's just that's the way the system is currently working, is we're all subsidizing either through our taxes or through those of us that have insurance full billing those reimbursements. So, the fact that Medicaid doesn't reimburse for births at the birth center the full cost, that's true for almost every piece of the Medicaid system.
Thank you. Could I just mention real quickly that nurse midwives are autonomous healthcare providers. They're independently licensed, and so historically they have collaborated with OBs in the Peace Health, in the nurse midwifery birth clinic as it has existed in the past, but they are independently licensed autonomous healthcare providers.
I just want to, number one, bring this session to a close. Number two, thank all of our presenters here. This has been very educational and very informational to the community. I'm glad the board did agree to this work session. As to whether we will take further action, we have a process for initiating work session requests, so we'll be taking that up in the future. So I'm not sure what else will happen, but we did do our work session today. I appreciate the comments everyone has made and the questions the commissioners have asked. Please stay in touch with us regarding future activities if they are to occur. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Take care.
Thank you very much.
And next up, we'll call up item number 2A, which is our presentation on Good Neighbor Authority opportunities. Tracy Beck, Forest Supervisor with the Willamette National Forest, and others are here, so please come up to the table, and you can bring another chair there to, go ahead and bring another chair up to the table. So we have a full array of I used to say folks in green, but I see the color scheme has changed, so there's a couple of traditionalists over there. If you could just introduce the people here, and I don't recall the timing, but I think you were informed we'd like about a 20-minute presentation. Okay, why don't you introduce the folks at the table and then start with your presentation.
Thank you, Chairman Sorensen. My name is Tracy Beck. I am the Forest Supervisor on the Willamette National Forest.
Good morning, all. My name is Chris Klein. I'm District Forester over in Commissioner Book's area, and Commissioner Burney out of Springfield.
Good morning. I'm Dave Lorenz. I'm the Southern Oregon Area Director for the Department of Forestry.
Good morning. Tim Leahy, Timber Program Manager on the Willamette National Forest.
And thank you for having us here today. And thank you, Vice Chairman Buck, for having a dialogue with us and realizing we needed to bring this topic in front of the full board. And we are here to talk about Good Neighbor Authority projects that we're starting to implement with the state. We did have kind of a surprise recently, so in the atmosphere of full disclosure and transparency, we want to present this information to you here today. It'll take us about 20 minutes or less to get through this PowerPoint presentation, and then we'll stay the rest of the time for any questions you might have. So next slide, please. So the Good Neighbor Authority allows the state to act as an agent of the Secretary of Agriculture. That's who we work for in the U.S. Forest Service, to carry out authorized forest, rangeland, and watershed restoration services on national forest system lands nationwide. There's a master agreement between the state of Oregon and the Forest Service signed in March 2016. So the state forester is on the right, the regional forester, the governor, and I'm not sure who the person on the left is. Ready? So we have a vision on the Willamette. The program, the timber program has been consistently, so we've sold between 70 and 80 million board feet a year. That's about that's about our capacity. We don't get funding to do anything more than that. It's been going on like that for about the past 15 years. We've been trying to increase that. We have a goal to reach 100 million in the next couple years. I'd like it to be next year. We're working toward a probable sale quantity of 116 million. That's what's established in the Northwest Forest Plan. We haven't done 116 million, so we could even go above that and make up some ground. The amount of traditional timber sales will stay roughly at the same amount, around 70 million board feet. Good Neighbor Authority sales and stewardship will be approximately 30 million. So that's how we're going to reach that 100 million. We can only grow the program using Good Neighbor Authority and stewardship. There's no more money out there. They're not giving us more money to deliver our program. And the appropriate, I just said it, the appropriated funding is not increasing. In order to grow our program, we have to use these other approaches and partner up and help us get this work done.
I'm thinking that partnership is where the state of Oregon comes through. Tracy and I, you know, we're used to partnering in the fire environment, and we have for a long time. And through this authority that's been granted, that gives the state a unique opportunity to help him out on the timber side. So we can accomplish more restoration on the national forest by the state helping. The state can provide human resources to get more work done. I know I have employees, and I think probably the most interesting part of this relationship is I have flexibility. I think, you know, different levels of government have different, you know, policies and procedures, and I think the key here is I can be much more flexible with my employee base and my hiring procedures and my contracting procedures than perhaps the federal government can be, therefore allowing me to provide services through this program at a quicker pace. The revenue from the G&A timber sale is reinvested on the forest to accomplish additional restoration, more vegetation management, stream restoration, et cetera. So as far as that revenue stream, I think it's important to me, goes to cover my costs so that the private landowners in the state of Oregon are not burdened with expenses there. So it does cover my costs, and then that revenue, all that revenue goes back into the forest and you know, stays local to missions on that forest. It's not a money-making venture for the Department of Forestry. Next slide. So how it works, the statute utilizes the state utilizes our own contract and procurement procedures. Basically, the crux to those first 4 bullet points, we follow our own state processes while complying with federal regulations. And again, much like the use of our employees, our processes are quicker, there's less paperwork, allows us to get more work done on the ground. You know, the nuance to it, some people have said, hey, if it's a state process, you might forego some of the important protection points of the federal government, and that's not the case. That last bullet point shows that the Forest Service provides guidance as needed, and it's key to note that we still must maintain all the federal regulations, just our process is quicker.
Okay, and so how are local GNA projects that we're just getting into benefiting ODF and the Willamette? Again, Chris talked about the money stay local to the Willamette National Forest. It goes back to being reinvested into projects and putting up more timber. The ability to provide more jobs for local operators and contractors adds value to the Willamette National Forest for additional volume and restoration projects.
And I think a real key for me, and actually I grew up in Douglas County, lived in the state my whole time. I go back to that bullet point about jobs. I think that's super key. It's moving wood, it's creating family wage jobs, but down to the ODF centric, the bottom half of that slide, it allows me to build capacity with my staff. Fire seasons the last half decade have been just off the charts and appear to be getting worse. And so this allows me to use some of my fire crews on the shoulder seasons as we're doing preparatory work for some of these timber sales. It's been very valuable to help keep these folks employed. Training standards are hard to meet in the first place, even more so if you have turnover in staff. And so this does provide not only jobs to the community, but also helps me as a fire manager in my program, keeping these folks employed. And that's probably, that's probably the biggest thing for the state's benefit.
Okay, we wanted to talk about kind of how the revenue distribution works in GNA sales and versus a traditional timber sale, because that's kind of where the rubber meets the road here. So in a GNA sale, what happens is that all that money goes into a GNA account that's called GNA revenue, and no money is deposited into the federal treasury. So what that means is that if it's a sale that's on ONC land, that there's no money that's deposited into the ONC account. For a traditional timber sale, 50% of the revenue from the ONC portion of that sale is deposited into the ONC account, and then it's then distributed based on a predetermined formula within that ONC regulations. And then secure rural schools, because I think that is an issue at play here. When that is authorized, counties can choose between timber receipts or SRS funding. In the past 17 years or so, counties have continually elected to get the SRS payments, as they're typically higher than the timber receipt payments. So now we'll move on to Twins GNA. This is a sale that we have that the state has laid out, and we're ready to sell. It's under GNA agreement. And it was kind of, we'll take ownership of this. This kind of popped up on us like, hey, this sale's got some ONC land in it, and how do we want to deal with this? So it's part of the reason why we're here. We want to be transparent. So you can see the purple units there are the sale units, and the crossed hatch is where they overlay with the ONC lands. So of this sale, it's about 262 acres. 117 of those acres are ONC, about 45%. And just to give you some perspective of where this is in the lower left there, it's in the Little Fall Creek drainage, just outside of Lowell. So it's right in and around a lot of warehouse or industrial lands. Okay, so just kind of an example here. I'm not saying that Twins is going to generate $100,000. It likely will generate more, but just to keep the math simple, I used $100,000. 45% of that acreage in the Twin sale is ONC. If the sale were to go as GNA, then all that revenue would go right into that GNA revenue account and not go as ONC. If we sold it as a traditional timber sale and that sale generated $100,000, $45,000 of that land, which is ONC, we would take 50% of that. So $22,500 would be deposited in the ONC account and then distributed, as I mentioned earlier. So I wanted to bring this slide up because this is a NEPA project that we have. We actually just signed the first phase of this. We call it Lowell Country, if anybody has heard of it. Same kind of area, it's just to the south of that Little Fall Creek drainage. And this one's kind of unique. Our NEPA documents typically have been between 1,000 and 2,000 acres at a time. This one we decided to pursue a little larger kind of landscape level approach. And we actually are going to clear about 15,000 acres of actual treatment on the ground through the NEPA process. And we, like I said, we just signed the first phase of that just a month ago or so.
And that represents around 230 million board feet. It's a huge project, biggest one we've ever done.
Yeah, by far. And it's our program on the Middle Fork District for the next 5 to 10 years. We're going to be working in this area. So it seemed to be a logical fit for GNA, and we've had some discussions in our next GNA agreement of adding some of the sales in this Lowell Country NEPA project area as a GNA sale. However, as you look, this also happens to be where a lot of our ONC land is. It's the darker green checkerboard up there. The next, like I said, the next phase, we're looking at putting a sale up there. We kind of put a pause on that until we had this discussion about ONC and how we want to move forward. We also looked at, is it possible to break the units up to where we're only doing, on the ONC land, we're doing just standard traditional timber sales. And it's very difficult because of the checkerboard nature up here. It kind of cuts units in half. It's just logistically very hard to pull off. And then also down on the bottom right there, in this sale, I said, the NEPA project is about 15,000 acres. Of that, approximately 6,700 acres are in ONC. So that's probably more acreage that we've cleared through NEPA and ONC in decades.
And that's 6,700 acres of thinning and fuels reduction. Okay, that's all the slides we had, and we'd be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Yeah, thank you so much, and thanks for the presentation. I noticed you were a little quiet during this presentation. Do you want to add anything?
Well, you hire good people and they say everything that needs to be said.
You help us put the fires out. That's how I know you.
Well, that's
what he's been doing.
That's kind of where I've been. Yeah, I've been down in Douglas County, so if I look a little ruffled, that's probably why. I appreciate the opportunity to be before you, Chair and fellow commissioners. Good Neighbor Authority, I think, is a really good opportunity to increase the pace and scale of restoration across the landscape. I've been asked repeatedly, why is ODF involved? You got enough to do, why are you involved? And it's because, quite frankly, as an Oregonian, I care about the forests, and I don't care whose forests they are, and it's an opportunity to, help with help restore the landscape, whether it's putting stocking levels at a more appropriate level that will help us combat fire when it comes through there, doing fuels treatment, as Tracy says, even some, it's even possible to do some stream restorations once we get some funding in the bank and can fund those sorts of things. So I care about the forests of Oregon, Department of Forestry cares about the forests of Oregon, and if we, and quite frankly, if we place these projects in appropriate places, it can help provide added protection to private forest lands that are out there, whether they're industrial or held by non-industrial folks. All that being said, we talked about the controverted lands, and that kind of came up in kind of towards the end of a couple of projects, and I'm pretty sensitive to that because of the way the revenue distribution is on those lands, because decisions that are made here affect all the counties that have ONC lands, and so we have to be thoughtful about how we proceed, I think, and the Good Neighbor Authority has been a tool that we've had available for, I kind of forget now, 3 or 4 years. It's been very active on the east side because it was ripe over there. And we've just kind of got started here in the last year, and it's really taken off fast. And so we're learning as we go, but it's pretty exciting stuff.
Good.
And I really honestly appreciate Tracy and the Willamette's passion for this and desire to move it along. So,
Well, from my perspective, I think the Good Neighbor Authority is really intended as a backfill for federal management agencies that are underfunded for projects that really benefit the environment. I think that's one of the major features of the Good Neighbor Authority. But one of the reasons I suspect you're here is because of the role of the county in receiving not only Forest Service funds, but Bureau of Land Management funds, O&C funds, and the overlap between Forest Service and O&C. And the fact that some of these programs, stewardship or Good Neighbor Authority, do not involve sharing the proceeds of timber sales with county governments. And in some ways, isn't the Knutson-Vandenberg, you had the KV up there, for those of us that kind of follow all this, isn't the use of the KV also a way for the federal government to retain the funds and reinvest the funds in the forest, as opposed to keeping some of the money but sharing some of the money under the 25% formula that you normally follow?
KV funding is generated by timber sales. It's deposits the purchasers make for post-harvest restoration activities. It doesn't relate really anything to the 25%.
Yeah, it's not shared with the counties
Right.
under the, and that's a way for the money to be invested back
Locally.
into the forest.
Yes.
And it certainly predates by many, many decades stewardship or Good Neighbor Authority, but it's another way in the appropriate circumstance for the federal government to retain the money and the county government not to receive the money, but to get the benefit of the reinvestment.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
And more employment.
And so, first point, I think, is that we, as advocates for the Forest Service, we, of course, believe the federal government should invest in the Forest Service. They are the owners of the land, and I can remember in many, many years ago, I guess we're getting into 40 years, I used to work for the Secretary of Agriculture, and the Willamette was producing 700 million board feet. And that number is quite a bit lower than the current number.
I was here in '89 and we did 850 million.
Yeah.
I was part of it.
Yeah, so that has been a big drop in the funding and to fund those timber sales. Now, the good news is we've made some more progress on protecting wildlife, and we have followed the dictates of Congress in other ways to try to protect the forest. But I think it's been fair to say that through a successive number of Congresses and administrations, that number is kind of stabilized in the way that you described at the 70 million board feet level. I just want to say that I think this briefing is good. It doesn't sound like we are going to need to say yay or nay, but just from my vantage point, I would say that the agreement that the state made with the Forest Service and to have another option, and Good Neighbor Authority being another option for us to pursue land management opportunities is a good thing. And I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad you took the time to explain that, yeah, some of this money, just put it out there, might come out of your hide, 22,000 in the example given, spread among 18 O&C counties, maybe $1,000 per county roughly on average, a little bit more.
Using that number.
Yeah,
Keep in mind that was
and there might be others. I get it. There might be others.
Sure.
And last but not least, correct me if I'm wrong, but there is no local opt-out. There's no like, hey, it might work okay for Grant County, but we don't want to do it in Lane County. It's a master agreement between ODF, the state, and the USDA, ODF, and the Forest Service. It's not really an opt-in or opt-out for a particular community.
Yes, sir. It's statewide.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I'm sure the commissioners will have questions, comments.
Actually, you covered my questions pretty well, other than a couple of perspective questions for me. The sale that you just delineated, did you say 237 total acres, including O&C lands?
262 acres, 117 is O&C.
117 is O&C. And I want to put that in perspective. 262 acres is a little less than a half of a square mile.
Correct.
So we're not talking about vast plots of land here. It's still a relatively small.
But we discovered this situation on this sale. It surprised us.
Yeah, but it's nicely spread, but it is less than a half of a square mile, so we're not.
Yes, sir.
Yeah. And to put that in perspective, West Fir is a little less than half a square mile, the city of West Fir.
Correct.
So, okay.
Very true.
So, and then the 2,700 acres that you mentioned that were going to be open for thinning and sustained yield, I think is, did you say that? Was it 2,700 acres? It was toward the end of the presentation.
Yeah, this is the Lowell Country project, which we've cleared about 15,000 acres through NEPA, of which 6,700 acres is ONC.
6,700 acres.
And that's direct treatment. So those are treatment acres with a associated volume and revenue.
So that's more than 25 square miles. So in comparison, that's, I'm 640 acres in a square mile.
Correct.
So the, really, while we are looking at a wonderful partnership and we're all excited about that, we're still not looking at a great deal of I mean, you said that you're hoping to achieve 100,000
100 million.
board feet in the next 2 years, and maybe
Yes, sir.
we'll do it. The Northwest Forest Plan authorizes 116 million board feet.
Correct.
And we don't really see that in our future unless this becomes far more robust than we expect.
Correct.
And, okay, all right. So we're not, once again, pretty tiny little numbers that we're looking at. Okay.
Okay, Commissioner Buck and Commissioner Bozievich.
I appreciate you all being able to come out and explain this to us and the fair warning. Because, if I boil it down, the two options is regular GNA, you get the regular percentage from an ONC cut that goes to the counties. And then in the other option, or maybe I have it backwards.
Yes.
I think I have it backwards.
Yep.
Thank you. In a regular, I should say in a regular cut. It will be
Regular
divvied
timber
out
sale.
as normal.
Yep.
In a GNA, the money, instead of the 50% going to the counties and being divvied up amongst the counties, it's going to go to the state, and then all of that money comes back to our county for jobs in restoration.
Correct.
Okay. And we did hear yesterday from Sarah Altmus-Pope from the Southern Willamette Forestry Collaborative about their support of this type of project as almost as a pilot project. So it would be, I would recommend, once, if these go through this way as a GNA project, which I think they will, it sounds like it's mandated in some sense.
Well,
that
I
right?
can, and that was part of my presentation that I forgot to talk about. I'm getting a lot of pressure from my boss, the regional forester, who's getting pressure from his boss, the chief, and everybody has a boss, and it kind of ends up at the president. We're getting pressure to use these tools that Congress passed for us to use to increase our program.
To get more board feet out for the state.
Exactly.
It would be good to be able to come back after the sales are done and give a rundown of how it went, how the results affected the county in the variety of ways, either in the amount of additional jobs, doing forestry, restoration, thinning, et cetera, versus the amount of money that normally would have put in the ONC kitty, and just get a rundown of what happened and how it happened and what was good, maybe what could be improved, et cetera.
We'd be glad to do that, and I could see a field trip.
Great.
Thank you. So, Tracy, one quick question. What's the annual estimated growth in the Willamette National Forest?
Billion board feet.
A billion board feet. So we're talking about maybe getting to 100 million. So we're still growing 900 million board feet
Yes, sir.
beyond what we're cutting. So
Yes, sir.
the 100 million board feet in thinning and brush clearing that we're doing is still being way overwhelmed by the growth rate as far as when we start talking about fire prevention and protection.
Yes, sir.
Just want to kind of point that out, folks, that, and even the 160 million board feet on the Northwest Forest Plan is still far below the growth rate. So nowhere coming close. So even the grand year that you had of 850 million board feet still wasn't the growth rate of the forest.
That's correct.
Yeah, so it's a sustainable harvest. So, Tracy, I'm going to apologize to you first because a lot of my comments are colored by my experience with the Siuslaw National Forest. I know you're the Willamette, and you guys have a little bit different philosophy. But the only reason we have good neighbor authority and stewardship contracting is because Congress has failed to adequately fund the Forest Service, and fire borrowing has eliminated the ability for these guys to actually lay out contracts. We are taking state funds to do something the Forest Service should be doing. Those jobs, it's not generating jobs. Those are jobs that should be happening anyway if we hadn't fire borrowed and eliminated the ability for these guys to lay out their own sales. Period. We're not creating any new jobs. We're making up for what Congress didn't fund with state funds. That's what good neighbor authority is. We're already putting $50 million a year into OWEB for watershed enhancement in our state budget. So we've got, that's what funds the, the watershed boards and all that around our state and does all the stream enhancements and places wood and streams and everything else they're doing. So, we've got that going. We're having to supply state money to help them lay out sales so they can do thinning to keep our forests from burning up because they borrowed all the money fighting fires because they weren't doing any of the thinning and the forests are burning up. So it's, Congress has to fix this. It's a temporary fix at best, good neighbor authority and stewardship contracting, because what, my experience with the Siuslaw Forest is almost every sale they do is stewardship, and they use it to keep staff on. And they've hired an immense amount of staff that has nothing to do with laying out sales and all that stuff. But that's, sorry, another forest. So I don't want to make I wanted to be careful because I think the last time I talked about this, I kind of grouped you in with everybody. I have a lot more appreciation of the way the Willamettes run.
Thank you.
So, this is really not necessary. I mean, we are using state money to fix a federal problem. And because we're diverting money, and mind you, it's not just the 50% from the O&C lands, it's also the 25% from the federal sales. 25% of federal sale revenue goes into road funds. And if we don't have SRS reauthorized, which there's no guarantee it will be, we go to actual timber harvest. So every sale that's under GNA and stewardship is taking away possible money out of our general fund and road fund, which that's what we use for law enforcement and doing roads. So people get hired there too. There's jobs from that. So we should be, as a board, lobbying Congressman DeFazio and our senators to fix the funding problems. They at least fixed some of the fire borrowing this last year, finally.
This is the last year of it.
Yeah, finally. So hopefully this will maybe start self-correcting. But we should be strongly advocating for adequate funding for staff in the Forest Service so they can be doing the layout for these sales and generating these sales. Because they also get, we get 25%, they get 75%. So if they're actually laying out and making these sales, it generates revenue for them. So, really, we shouldn't be doing good neighbor authority sales. We shouldn't be doing stewardship sales. They should all be standard timber sales. You guys should have the staff necessary to lay them out. We should be harvesting at the levels of the forest plan. And then that money comes into the counties. We can start providing the services everybody wants. And we talk about things like we want to take on a birth center. We want to try and help the homeless. We want to try and increase our rural patrol. None of that's happening without revenue. And this is one of those sources of revenue. And the only reason it's not coming in right now is because this federal government has chosen to underfund the staffing of the Forest Service. So we're having to take state employees and do the work of the federal government.
Commissioner Bozovich, when I was on the Willamette in '89 and we did 850 million board feet, we had 1,200 employees on this forest. Right now, we have 375.
Go ahead.
For a point of clarification, in terms of state funding, there is some state funding that funds our federal forest restoration program, and I think it's about $1.5 million a year. And a portion of those dollars do fund some positions that work on some Good Neighbor Authority projects, but the bulk of the funding that will go forward with funding positions to do the layout is from the timber sales themselves. So just a point of clarification. But you're right, there's definitely some.
This places money that would come to the counties, provided there's no SRS reauthorization, and we go back to actual harvest dollars coming to the county.
Okay, Commissioner Burney.
While you were harvesting in the late 80s, 890 million board feet, I was processing 40 million pounds of special cut broccoli a year, and I thought what I was doing was a big deal. I appreciate the information. I have great respect for guys on the ground doing the work. I may not always agree with the work, but that's not what I'm referring to here. I'm just saying, but I always respect the people that are on the ground getting the job done. I fail to, now that's very different than the people in Congress that Commissioner Bozovich was talking about, or even us right now. I'm too old to do that. But I honestly, when you look at big picture, fail to see any area of federal, state, public activity where the funding, in my mind, is done in a logical, coherent, and reasonable manner. Everybody is scrambling. Everybody is creating new mechanisms to sort of get done what they were kind of doing. So I appreciate the information. Just, full disclosure, everything seems to be driven by money, right? And sometimes there's things that need to get done. I appreciate learning about this. I have a ton of questions. I don't want to show you how stupid I am by asking them all. I'd take you up on that field trip because I really do want to learn about granularly, right? I mean, what you guys know, like the back of your hand, how this works. What does this kind of management look like? For example, my wife and I were driving to Crater Lake a few weeks ago, and we were seeing these huge piles of what I assume was wood that was being thinned. But these were huge piles drying up, and I'm guessing the money didn't exist to get them the hell out of there, because to me they looked like traps for a fire if a fire occurred. And, this is very basic questions, but these are the kinds of questions I have that is not for this presentation. I guess the only substantive thing, other than these sort of anecdotal remarks, is Commissioner Buck asked for a report, and you said gladly. I would love, if you're willing, if it's not requesting too much, I'd love sort of an interim sort of status on how it's going, so I could better understand, again, the implications for all of this regarding, from forest management, stream restoration, forest restoration, the funding, which honestly, while I know counties care about, it's not that much money like it used to be. So I thank you for being here. I thank you for taking your time. It was easy to listen, and I took a ton of notes, and I'll continue to do that.
Thank you.
Okay, any other questions from commissioners before we move on? Commissioner Farr?
Thank you. A question regarding board footage, the 167-acre sale, about how many board feet come out of that? I understand that, I don't know if you've had.
The whole sale's, I believe, slightly over 4 million board feet.
4 million board feet.
Yeah.
And, okay.
And about half of that, 45% is ONC, so.
Okay.
Which is a normal size sale for us.
And I'm okay, sounds good. Thank you very much. That just gives me I'm trying to put things in perspective because we're talking abstracts quite a bit as far as, how lumber is cut. And according to the Idaho Forest Products Commission, it takes about 26,000 board feet per house to build a house for a 2,000 square foot house.
26, really?
That's an estimate, and that's by one estimate. So you can do math on what that equals as far as residences are concerned. And then the 160, the city of Eugene is about 45 square miles. So that sale is less than 1% the size of the city of Eugene in terms of acreage. I'm just putting things in perspective, the sheer size of things. You know, you fly from Eugene to Denver over the forests, and you go over miles and miles and miles and miles and miles of open land, forest land. And this, once again, is 1/2 mile by 1 mile. Yeah. Less than is about 0.4 miles. So that's square miles. Okay. All right. Thank you.
But with the future expanding some, that's why we're here.
I just wanted to make one more comment before you all head out is, I hear Commissioner Bozovich's argument about, lack of congressional action, and, which is a valid argument. In the meantime, the jobs that should be aren't there now. Is that correct? And this is a way in which to at least get some of the jobs going.
Yeah, for every 1 million board feet we sell, that's about 10, has direct impact on 10 jobs.
Which then feed into your wildfire.
Sure, absolutely. Some of those are for my folks, but more so, there's actually the contracting community, the operators, the loggers, the truck drivers,
The mills.
the mills.
Yeah, that's 10 private sector jobs.
Yeah, right.
Private sector.
Not my folks.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, and your expertise, being able to do the restoration projects, including thinning, does that have a direct impact on, wildfire issues that we're facing now?
Absolutely.
Without a doubt.
Yeah. So I'm an incident commander on one of the Pacific Northwest incident management teams with the state of Oregon, 32-year career. The forest fuels, to Commissioner Bozovich's point, I feel very confident in my professional opinion. Our forests are outgrowing, from a fire standpoint and a vegetative buildup standpoint, any point of good health. Our wildfires are not burning like they did 120 years ago, when as a society we decided to start putting them all out, and they're destroying the forest. And so this is good work. It's thinning from a fire management standpoint. Anytime you can reduce that fuel load, it gives the men and women that are out there doing the work a chance to actually get close to it, instead of having to stay miles away. So yeah, this is good stuff. I guess my point and why I'm getting a little passionate about it is, to Commissioner Bozovich's point, it's not enough. It is going to do good work, and it will provide us areas outside of Lowell to potentially catch fire and keep it from coming onto private ground. But, and to Commissioner's far point, in the scope and size and scale, my hope before my career ends is this will increase. It's not nearly enough.
Okay. I just wanted to ask, there aren't any plans to sell any large tracts of Forest Service land, are there?
No, sir.
I know that that's been a controversy in Washington, D.C. about the tension between advocates of selling off federal land and advocates of retaining them. And I just wanted to, just on the Forest Service half or third of that picture, you're not aware of any policy changes coming down?
I'm not aware of any.
I was going to say that one of the developments in public land that I think is worth mentioning is that the Trump administration just appointed a BLM director yesterday who does advocate selling off federal lands. I don't know if that'll translate into policy or not, and I know that's interior, not agriculture, but something that would be a big concern of ours as Oregon leaders in a state that's half owned by the federal government. If the federal government's policy would change, and that they would put in place a disposal policy of getting rid of federal lands in Oregon. But that's outside the scope of this conversation. But I just let you know that we are monitoring that, and I'm certain that our congressional delegation will be fighting if the Trump administration does try to sell off BLM lands.
I'd like to just quickly take advantage of the brain trust assembled before us. Do you know the cost to the Forest Service for 1 million board foot for the use of a number sale?
Cost in terms of being able
The
to.
preparation. Yeah.
I'll give you some other numbers.
And then the
So
restoration.
It takes about $5 million. The region sends us $5 million to produce that 70 to 80 million board feet.
Okay.
Then that generates 15 million excess. So we're a good buy.
Oh, no, I
we have
wasn't
good
trying to
value.
suggest you're not. I was just trying to understand the numbers.
Yeah.
And then are all the logs from such sales milled in Oregon?
Yes, there's laws that don't let us export logs, so everything stays local. And generally,
Oh, I was just going to say, they can't export a raw log. They can process it and then export.
right, they have to, I think, saw one side.
Okay, so they can process, then export for further processing.
But most of it stays here local in the valley.
Does it?
Yeah, just about all of it, yeah. I don't know. You know, we had some bigger logs that we put up from the Terwilliger fire from danger trees along roads, and some of those might have had, you know, a saw length taken off it and exported, because there's not a lot of mills around that saw that big stuff anymore.
Although, see, I was told, and this is just, I was told by a couple of friends that own mills that the logs have to be milled domestically, but not necessarily in Oregon. But I'm just
Everything
trying
off
to
the
understand.
Yeah, that's correct. Everything off the Willamette stays here in Oregon because it's so far to California or Washington or Idaho. But yeah, if there's a forest adjacent to one of those state lines, yeah, those logs could go out of Oregon.
Thank you.
And the majority of our sales are sold to Swanson, Roseboro, Seneca, Freris, or non-manufacturers.
This happened to be one or two of the people I was talking to. Thank you very much.
Okay, we're getting, go ahead, Commissioner Farr.
Dave, you mentioned jobs. You said that you had 1,200 jobs that are now 375 jobs. Over what?
That was me.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, Tracy. Over what time period did we go from 1,200 to 375 jobs?
Well, once the Northwest Forest Plan came into effect in 1994, most of the jobs went away. So we went from 1,200 to something much less. And today we're at about 375. And we've been climbing just a little bit, but pretty much just staying static in the 5 years I've been here.
More than 800 less jobs now, just in the forest management alone.
Yeah, from 1994 to now.
That doesn't include processing and shipping.
Oh, no, that's just Forest Service employees,
Government employees.
permanent job.
Thanks.
All right, well, thank you so much. This has been great, and thanks so much for checking in, and thanks to Commissioner Buck and Mr. Beck, all of you, to get this organized so quickly, and we really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Good luck with the fire season.
Yeah, no kidding.
Thank you very much.
All right, next up for the Board of Commissioners is item number 3 on our calendar, on our agenda. That's our executive session, and this time I'll read our executive session notice. After we get that read, we'll be recessing for about 5 minutes to go up to the Commissioners' Conference Room. We don't anticipate coming out of executive session, but we may, and that would occur under item 4, other business. So this time I'll read our executive session notice. The Board of County Commissioners will meet in executive session to conduct deliberations with persons designated by the governing body to negotiate real property transactions. This executive session is held pursuant to RS 192.6602E, which allows the Board of Commissioners to meet in executive session for the purposes listed. Representatives of the news media and designated staff shall be allowed to attend the executive session. All other members of the audience are asked to leave the room. Representatives of the news media are specifically directed not to report on any of the deliberations during executive session, except to state the general subject of the session as previously announced. No decision may be made in executive session. We reserve the right to come back out into public session should the need arise. And so we're going to be ending our public meeting now. We'll be in recess for about 5 minutes to go up to the Commissioners' Conference Room. News media is welcome to join us. So we're in recess till we reconvene in executive session.